Rush Limbaugh offered a history lesson on slavery and race on his radio show Monday, telling listeners, if any race of people should not have guilt about slavery, it's Caucasians. Commenting on the public's response to the not guilty verdict in the George Zimmerman trial, Limbaugh advised that it's time for all this white guilt to end, because it is doing nothing for nobody and not solving anything.
White supremacy. The belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups, in particular Black or Jewish people.
Almost every American family knows the pain when a loved one is diagnosed with a serious illness. Here tonight is a special man, beloved by millions of Americans, who just received a stage 4 advanced cancer diagnosis.
Hey, welcome to another episode of Uncle Ricky's House. Tonight we're going to talk about a white supremacy ploy, plot, mind game position that's called Forget About It. And you heard Rush Limbaugh tell his audience, which is mostly conservative, white, and coons, black coons. Yeah, I said it. That white people should not feel guilty about slavery. That they are tying themselves in knots, twisting themselves up over nothing because they weren't there then. They weren't the slaveholders. They didn't bring them. They didn't bring black people, black men and women and children in chains from Africa, bring them to the United States, work them like dogs, sell them like property to put money in their white pockets. Well, in theory, maybe on the surface, maybe this might be a good philosophy. But see, physically, Limbaugh is correct. None of us were there then. I wasn't there as a slave, and if you're white and listening and watching this, you weren't there as a slave master. But see, what Limbaugh is not saying, the other side of the pillow, the other shoe that has to drop, is that he's basing this all on the theory that white people should be in charge anyway, and black people should just forget about slavery.
Slaves were not free labor. Like wage labor, they cost the employer. However, the transaction and relation that legitimized the ownership of the slave by the master differed. Slaves' employers had property rights over them. The owners who held title over bondsmen purchased the slave's body. Thus, the masters controlled the labor and the produce, including children, of the slaves until they died, were sold, or gained freedom. Employers who hired wage laborers possessed just the workers' labor for an agreed-upon period, in return for some type of currency. Slave prices in antebellum America varied. The fluctuations of the market affected prices as did the talents or weaknesses possessed by the slaves. In the South, after 1830, skilled slaves cost between $1,500 and $2,000.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy: the Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa.
Just because the slaves had been freed, it didn't mean that they were going to have equal rights. After the Civil War, you had formerly enslaved Americans that were just really set out to fend on their own. They had been separated from their families. They didn't have jobs for the most part. They did not know how to read and write. African Americans had to begin to work hard just to become citizens of this country.
They needed to be educated. They needed to be given health care. And most importantly, they needed jobs. And what skills did they have for the jobs that might be there?
The fate of African Americans was further complicated by the fact that in the border states of Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, slavery was still technically legal.
The Civil War ends in 1865, and the Union Army celebrates with a triumphant parade down Washington's Pennsylvania Avenue. But while the fighting is over, conflict continues through the era known as Reconstruction.
The 13th Amendment neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
14th Amendment. Section 1. The 14th Amendment: all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
The Constitution of the United States that guaranteed that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
Whether oblivious, bigoted, or living behind a thick wall of denial, many members of the Southern elite believed their slaves were A-OK with living in bondage. While the abolitionist movement took root in the late 1700s and the prohibition of slavery had been codified in all northern states by around the turn of the century, some land-owning Southern elites scoffed at the idea, feeling very sure their slaves were happy right where they were. So, when the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, abolishing slavery and involuntary servitude throughout the United States, those Southern elites were pretty confused when their former slaves quit and left.
And their business because of the cheap and free labor. When you read the 13th Amendment, that basically was the amendment that broke through slavery and freed the men and women who were enslaved at the time. There's a clause in there that allows for the re-enslavement of people in the event that they're convicted of a crime. And so in prisons throughout our country, you have people who are working for basically free. And if they're not working for free, they're working for wages that if we saw that happen in another country, we would be very critical of. When I was in prison, I worked for 17 cents an hour.
The results of the Civil War put an end to slavery in America once and for all. So what came next for all the African-American freedmen who are unsure of their futures? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all came about during the Reconstruction period, with the intended purposes of mending the atrocities of slavery and fixing the social and political inequities many blacks faced in the U.S. These amendments are important, but, unfortunately, they would not be enough to ensure full rights for African Americans. Throughout the late 19th century and well into the 20th century, much of the progress gained during the great experiment of racial democracy was undone due to political and racial tensions brought about during Reconstruction.
Recap. Nathan Bedford Forrest is not some kind of on-the-bubble figure, an edge case with a complicated legacy. He's not someone the woke mob has suddenly decided to come for. He is probably one of the top 10 villains in American history, just a vile, vile, evil man. A plantation owner and slave trader, his most infamous act as a Confederate general came at the Battle of Fort Pillow in 1864. Forrest's soldiers massacred a bunch of Union troops, many of them black, and many of whom were attempting to surrender when they were killed. The Confederacy then abandoned the position that night. They didn't even need to hold the fort. It was an atrocity, and it was recognized as such at the time. This is from the New York Herald on April 14th, 1864. Tales of a horrific massacre, the dead and wounded burned by Confederate forces, reported massacre of the white and black troops. It reverberated throughout the country as one of the most vile, despicable war crimes of the Civil War. But Nathan Bedford Forrest wasn't done yet. After the Confederacy was defeated, Forrest managed to escape justice. He was not imprisoned nor executed. No, he went back to civilian life and became, an early
to our kids in schools, these black savages are our equals. They're our brothers and sisters. I tell them they're crazy. We're white people. We're standing up for our white rights. The Klan is the only organization that stands up for the white rights.
District of Tulsa, Oklahoma was once home to nearly 35 blocks of black-owned businesses. But the community that took years to build was erased in less than 24 hours by racial violence. Danya Backus explores the history of the area that was known as Black Wall Street, including her own family connection to the neighborhood.
One of the most important cases in U.S. history, the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education. Let's start the show. Because black people often didn't have representation in their state or congressional bodies, it sometimes made changing laws through legislation difficult. But the courts were one avenue through which black Americans were able to fight for their citizenship rights and feel like they had a chance. When the Constitution was amended to include the Reconstruction Amendments, aka the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, black Americans were formally made citizens of the United States. And citizenship is important because it affirms that you have access to rights and resources in your country. But many white Americans weren't okay with black Americans becoming citizens. They benefited from black Americans not having the same protections and resources that they did. And so white Americans created Jim Crow laws that implemented segregation and hindered black Americans' right to vote. We'll talk more about the civil rights movement and the fight to vote in a few more episodes. But segregation is an important place to start.
Well, I can stop here. There's really no need to continue because most of you have already made up your mind. I made this video for the ones that are sitting on the fence, the white ones, and yeah, some black ones too, and other minorities that are falling victim, maybe even for the first time, to overt white supremacy, big time, full time. White supremacists don't like anybody that's not white. Don't fool yourself. Don't think you can fit in where you get in. Because the supremacists that are out there now, it's not even about the money. It's all about the hate, baby. They don't need slavery. There's nothing to make you a slave for. They just want something to hate, something to oppress, something that they can put their boot on the back of their neck and grind it into the ground so they can feel superior. Don't fool yourself. If you don't get it, you won't get it. But for those who are out there trying to make up their mind, that have doubts about whatever side they're on, I hope this helped push you in the right direction. And I got a special shout out for the people back in Nottoway County that are fighting to get those Civil War memorials removed. Keep that fight up, because if the sentiment that made those memorials didn't mean anything, if the hate that they signify, if the white supremacy that they give authority to, even subliminally, especially at the courthouse, the seat of justice, that spirit of hate ain't dead. And all we can do is continue to stand up against it. Well, goodbye and so long from Uncle Ricky's house. Peace out and God bless.